disciplines. Of course, in the last 10, 20, 30 years, we have been talking about inter and transdisciplinarity a lot. But of course, if you look at the structure of the university, of course, there are still a lot of fairly traditional disciplines, and a lot of disciplines, in fact, and humanities here are really no exception, go back to the late 19th century, mid-late 19th century, and the German system. And of course, we have added things. So 50 years ago, you would not find American studies as a separate discipline, especially in terms of departments and grant systems. We do now. So things have been expanding. But a lot of the academic system is fairly old and goes back at least 100 years. And of course, again, I don't want to go into heavy theory because that's really no fun, and I have really cool slides to show. But if you look about disciplines, of course, Michel Foucault, as always, had something to say, and in one of his, very strangely, I find that title book, Discipline and Punish, and he does talk about university too. So Discipline and Punish, Birth of a Prison, one of his best books. He says, and he's actually talking about academic disciplines, that disciplines characterize, classify, specialize, or distribute along a scale around a norm, hierarchize individuals in relation to another, and if necessary, disqualify and invalidate. And this is really this last part, disqualify and invalidate, that would apply, or has for a better, or did for a better long apply to the kind of things that I like to talk about today. So science fiction, comics, and or graphic novels, and video games, and even when these media existed, or forms, cultural forms existed, for a very long time they were excluded, they were sort of disqualified and invalidated as popular culture for a very long time. That has been changing, of course, and but if you tell somebody, yeah, I do, which I always, or very often do, I do science fiction studies, and then the question, especially if it's from someone slightly older or more conservative, the question is, oh, so you study E.T. now. And then, of course, there is, rolling of eyes, and, and sort of off-stage comments about, yeah, them doing E.T. or, or sort of video games. So what I would like to talk about why we should study these things, not could, but actually should study these things. But before that, I'd like to essentially do three things. First, I'd like sort of to give you some sort of sense of the lay of the land. I don't know how much people know about it. I'm really shooting in the dark. Maybe you all have been reading comics and playing video games, and of course you have loved science fiction, although not necessarily in the academic context. So I'd like to give a sense what these three disciplines are and what we really talk about, both in terms of the subject matter and methods. Then propose how they change our thinking about culture in general. So not just kind of those little sectarian sections or parts of culture. And then finally, yeah, come to the part where I try to convince you that we should, not could, can study these things. So the first is, of course, what, right? What are we really talking about? And my first contention is always that, and I'm going to be talking about science fiction studies, comic studies, and game studies, although in many ways there are 5 or 6 or 7 other disciplines previously belonging to what we previously called popular culture that could just serve as equally good examples. But I'm going to concentrate on those 3 because this is where I feel most comfortable. So whenever you think about the subject matter of these fields, these disciplines, science fiction, comics, and video games, so probably everything you think you know is wrong. Okay? That always gets people's attention. And of course, unless you have been really following these forms closely, then probably not everything that you know is wrong, but a lot of it is probably wrong. Or when you think about science fiction as something different from what I think when I think of science fiction, and the same goes for the other 2 parts. So for instance, when you do think about science fiction, most people all imagine these, the gods hate Kansas. And I really, really like, Jack Chalker, top center. mean, he was a fairly decent writer, but I always found 90 trillion Fausts, right? Like, you can't do. There was a story by A.C. Clarke, the specialist guy, 9 billion names of God. So Jack Chalker clearly wanted to do better, 90 trillion Fausts. Or you associate science fiction, many people associate science fiction with sort of really bad either TV shows or movies, particularly applied by Sci-Fi Channel, so really kind of a low end of fantastic. When I think about science fiction or when most people who do science fiction studies think about science fiction, something entirely different. The kind of names or titles that may appear on the radar occasionally, but are definitely a very different proposition. So much more philosophical, much more engaged with now and here. It's almost a commonplace thing to say that science fiction tells you nothing, absolutely nothing about the future, and tells you everything about now and here, and has never done anything else except talking, telling stories, talking about now and here. When you think about comics, or when most people think about comics, or sometimes the more glorified name, graphic novels, has been used in the last 2 or 3 decades. This is what people think about. Sort of either really bad pulp comics, like Action Comics, and then those really weird mashups like Superman versus Muhammad Ali. Guess who wins in that particular one? Probably wouldn't guess who wins. Or a Catwoman, or those sort of cartoon strips that may be witty, but for many people the proposition that they should be studied or that they actually have something to say, apart from cracking jokes, would be ridiculous. When I think about comics and graphic novels, again, I think, for instance, about possibly the best text about 9/11 to have emerged from Western culture, which is Art Spiegelman's, the guy who wrote Mouse, which is probably more famous, In the Shadow of No Towers, which is this large size, about A3 format size, I guess a comic book about 9/11 and what exactly happened on that day and after that day, in terms not just in the Twin Towers but in American cultural life. Or I think of about a whole number of other graphic novels, things like Stuck Rubber Baby, which may not be much of a title, but it's probably one of the best, not just graphic novels, texts about cultural texts about the civil rights era and what it meant to live in the South in the late 1960s, and on top of that, to be gay, as the main character is. Or Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, who is now credited as the author of this Bechdel test, where you test the gender representation in any cultural text. Alison Bechdel last year received the MacArthur Fellowship, the so-called Genius Fellowship that in the past went to people who were pension. So that's the kind of stuff that I talk about. When you talk about video games, right, of course, most people will think about, either this 1993 Doom, where you basically, the simple principle is shoot everything that moves, and if it doesn't move, just shoot it just to be on the safe side anyway. Or Grand Theft Auto, which has been receiving, the last one, the number 5, that has been receiving a lot of negative attention in the last 2 or 3 years for its violence, for its depiction of women, for its basically gratuitous being over the top. But of course, you could, when you talk about the medium, and that's what I do, think about texts, and I use, of course, the word text in the broadest cultural studies sense. You could talk about Gone Home, or Kentucky Route Zero, a beautiful game about the titular Route Zero, which of course does not really exist. Or a 5-part Life is Strange, which is about growing up in a small town when you're in high school. Or Papers, Please, that I will talk briefly about later on. So very clearly, when different people talk about these 3 forms, science fiction, comics, and video games, they actually do very different things. But of course, if you ask, okay, so what can we study about these or in these things? I think the answer is pretty much everything. I mean, everything that you study when you study novels, or everything that you study when you study films, and probably much more. So in all of these, the so-called textual criticism, which will try to break down these texts in terms of, I mean, any sort of political, gender, sexual, formal, aesthetic lines. There has been a lot of it. Definitely you study audiences, which in traditional literary study you do very rarely, or there are very few people who have historically done that. You study media technologies that are used in the production of these forms. You can study its politics, you can study a very specific kind of audiences that we call fandoms, that is much more than just kind of a passive people loving text and sort of occasionally posting comments online. You can study about visualities, you can study about audio design. So essentially every single thing and more that you think you can study about respectable, so-called respectable cultural text. And just to give you a sense how much of it has been going on, to give you a sense of, for instance, science fiction studies as the first of these three fields, there are at least three major international academic associations dealing with that. Each of them sort of has the membership between 300 and 500, which, you know, compared to MLA may not be a lot, but remember we're talking about you know, a very specialized field. We're talking about 4 cyclical annual conferences, each of which again draws between 200 and 400 people, and in the last 10 years, dozens of one-off conferences. We're talking about 5 major journals just devoted to science fiction. Annually, we have anywhere between 30 and 50 monographs, book monographs coming out on the biggest publishing presses, and hundreds of articles and chapters in other publications. And we're really, in the US alone, we're talking about hundreds of both undergraduate and graduate level courses taught in American universities. And Europe has been sort of lagging behind, but things have been improving. And science fiction studies is not even among these 3 the biggest. When you talk about game studies, essentially you would have to multiply all these numbers by 5. And that gives you a sense that this is real. These are not really sort of tiny nooks of the academic world where people, you know, like myself, want to justify why they read science fiction, why they play video games. But hey, I do research when I play video games. This is more research. So this is the what. This was the what. Now, how do these forms contribute, or how do they change how we understand culture in general? I very pointedly do not use the term popular culture. They do. I mean, if you look at what was previously known as popular culture, of course, there's a long-standing tradition, especially in Europe, of basically looking down on it. And one of my favorite, of course, it's, you know, very toxic, but one of my favorite quotes is, of course, poor Theodore and his Frankfurt School, you know, in the late 1940s, sort of completely dumping it on the entire, mostly Americans. There was a political dimension to that, of course. Adorno hated Hollywood. I mean, he thought Hollywood represented, you know, the worst of human civilization, period. So when he says that amusement underlay capitalism's prolongation of work, of course that's a political argument. No independent thinking must be expected from the audience. The product describes every action, and a logical connection calling for mental effort is painstakingly avoided. And of course, I wonder what he would have said about Transformers if he thought that about the 1940s Hollywood cinema. But I mean, right where you see, I mean, he doesn't, you know, there's no even room for discussion about these texts, about this so-called popular culture. If you look at other people like Dwight MacDonald, another important cultural critic, when he says it's fabricated by mass culture, another term that both the Frankfurt School and people like MacDonald used to describe what we call popular cultures. I love that quote. It's fabricated by technicians hired by businessmen. Its audiences are passive consumers. So again, this sort of passive manner of their participation limited to the choice between buying and not buying the lords of kitsch. Isn't it a wonderful phrase? The lords of kitsch. In short, exploit the cultural needs of the masses, presumably we are the masses, in order to make a profit and or to maintain that class rule. So of course, again, a very political approach, but you know, the core of that and whatever European, American problems or anxieties there could have been in the 40s and the 50s of the 20th century, there is very clearly also a cultural judgment about how valuable, in fact, invaluable these texts. And again, not really video games to speak of, and comics didn't even come under the radar of any kind of academic scrutiny back then. But science fiction was around fairly firmly, mostly associated with paperback novels and pulp magazines. You know, this is how these people would have looked at it. So this is the thing previously known as. So this led to the creation of this sort of, well, in a sense informal, but very deeply entrenched division between what nowadays we probably, when we talk about these things, we call high culture, but really people who subscribe to that side of academia and sort of cultural life, just described as culture. Assuming that everything else was not, and everything else, you know, had to be prefaced with either mass and folk and or low or pop or popular, and if you were particularly generous, you would have called it middle brow, which was probably the least offensive of these terms. And the basic argument, as you can see from my really cool pictures here, was that somehow those completely sweet, you know, puke, excuse my French, inducing Baroque paintings were somehow better than Lady Gaga's music videos. And of course, not that they existed at the same time, but you know, from our perspective, and there are still a lot of people who will subscribe to the perception, will say, yeah, I mean, those cherubs from the 17th century that were much worse than the 17th century equivalent of Lady Gaga's videos are better than Lady Gaga's videos. And whatever you think about her music or about her as a public persona, and you know, very controversial, I mean, her music videos are really genius. And they are very Baroque incidental too, in all kinds of ways. But that sort of structure persisted for a long time, and I suspect that it still persists. You know, in many places, sometimes it's regional, sometimes it's to do with particular universities in various countries. Now, of course, that has been changing, and that, well, I hope it has changed. What I call emergent disciplines, when they finally came into their own sometime in the late 1980s, the 1990s, including the three examples that I'm talking about, this is science fiction studies, comic studies, and video game studies slightly later. So that coming into their own is a consequence of a number of transformations and changes in culture, both academic and otherwise. Definitely the rise of cultural studies as a academic discipline, particularly the version of the Birmingham School and Stuart Hall in the late 1950s and the 1960s, was a great emancipatory factor. Definitely the broadly understood or misunderstood postmodernism helped a lot, since it always privileged sort of voices or perspectives that were not really included before, or were perceived as kind of lowly and sort of lacking any value. On the other hand, the neoliberal economy, which, you know, probably if you understand what it is, you have to dislike it. But neoliberal economy, with its complete abandonment of any political or cultural positions in the name of making money every time, every place, helped too, because basically the so-called, the thing previously known as popular culture is just another product, and you don't really care about systems or hierarchies of value. And definitely in the last 10, 15 years, the digital technologies of both production and distribution helped much too. A lot of what I'm talking about is a product of digital culture. It uses very sophisticated technologies and solutions for both the production and distribution, and contributes to this sort of global spread. So this, you know, very diverse combination of these factors definitely made it possible for me to stand here and talk about science fiction and video games, which probably in many places would not have been happening 10 years ago or 15 years ago. With cultural studies, of course, and cultural studies in many ways is the most important of these developments, the rise of cultural studies. And its basic assumptions about, of course, different structures of taste, or different structures of cultural value, but also commitment to the political agenda, and definitely a lot of what is, for instance, being done these days in science fiction studies or video game studies is politically motivated or has a political dimension, so we do not just look at these texts as systems of metaphors, visual or verbal or otherwise, but as texts that have a very strong bearing on the world, and texts that reflect what is going on, both good and bad. Seems like it's mostly bad recently in this world. So definitely this political commitment and the idea that doing things in academia and cultural studies is not just basically doing research, it's also trying to bring about some sort of change in thinking has been very central and very important to these disciplines. And incidentally, this is kind of an a digression. If you find these things interesting and you ever wonder, okay, but how do I, since most of us here in this room understand teach or are going to teach, how do I give it to my students? There is actually, for a few years now, one book which I have found absolutely magnificent. You can use it even in undergraduate courses, but it explains those basic concepts. Some of them fairly convoluted, but this book does this, in a very simple, very clear language in terms of argumentation, without sort of pedestrianizing these concepts. The theory toolbox has really worked wonders in all kinds of students in a number of places. But anyway, back to my second question. So, what do these disciplines, well, these discourses, but also disciplines that study them, what do they bring to the cultural table? What do they change? Well, of course, they change a lot of things. And asking that question, in a sense, will always lead to a fail in answering it, because there are, depending where you are, what kind of things you're interested in, you will justify science fiction or video games in different ways. But I would like to propose one for each. And of course, this is not really the only thing that they bring to this larger cultural table. So science fiction, I would like to argue, and I'm sort of proselytizing a little bit at this point, is really the cultural imaginary of the 21st century. It was probably the cultural imaginary of the second half of the 20th century, but I would argue that without science fiction, which is a certain way of thinking about the world using just different mediums, the so-called realist literature or realist film uses. Science fiction gives us this tool for thinking about what has been happening around us and what we would like or would not like to happen around us. And in fact, I would like to argue that it's impossible to think about the now and definitely not the future, even in most realistic terms, without sort of falling back on the tropes, on the stories, on the metaphors that have been traditionally associated with science fiction. The best example of that is when 2 or 3 weeks ago NASA was reporting, the new development in their research into black holes, which of course it's still a very cutting edge field and we know very little about these phenomena. And when they posted this announcement of whatever was the latest report at that point on their website, what image do they choose to illustrate it with? Of course, as you may or may not recognize, this is one of those iconic images from Interstellar, the major Hollywood movie with Matthew McConaughey and a bunch of other people. The movie that is not even particularly, well, I'm trying to be gracious. I mean, it is an interesting movie. Okay, I wouldn't call it a classic. But so I mean, when NASA, the most serious of serious organizations, talks about science or whatever they are, they will use imagery from science fiction films. Oh, and Pentagon, again, a fairly serious and non-fictionally oriented bunch of people, want to talk about future. They will, 2045 would they very often do, in fact, and they have been doing that since the 1950s. Once a year, the Department of Defense and Pentagon have been bringing, every year visit different people, a bunch of science fiction writers, paying them a lot, and basically putting them in one room for 2 days and asking them to just talk about what is going to happen. And someone is taking very careful notes. How much of it goes into policy decisions is a different matter, but the fact that they give ear to this kind of perspectives is, I think, very, very telling. Now with comics, among other things, I think as a cultural form, allow us to reclaim visuality. And especially if you come from any kind of literary, or even sort of traditional cultural context, visuality, images, pictures, have been very, very suspected, unless you talk about pre-early 20th century art history. Again, generally a very conservative discipline, far more conservative than most humanities. So visuality in the Western culture in the throughout the 20th century was really, pictures were suspicious because the opinion went, they sort of diluted things, that somehow they were more appropriate for children. They did not really have the sophistication, the depth of verbal expression, which of course was the most privileged one, most prominently exemplified in that form of a novel. Comics allow us, contemporary comics, like, for instance, and this is actually a Batman comic, right? And if you think you know what Batman comics look like, well, probably you did not. Comics are, of course, the combination of verbal and visual, verbi visual, as some people call it, expression. But some of them require, a increasing number of them, requires, a fairly good visual background to be able to read meaning from them, to be able to understand them. So they not all, definitely, but many comics and graphic novels allow us to relearn that, in fact, no, visuality is important, supposedly. If you listen to people like Mitchell, we have been living inside this pictorial turn for the last 20 or 30 years. So sort of sticking to the idea that words are the only form of meaningful expression is kind of antiquated. Now with video games, and again, there are, of course, very different video games, but one proposition that one aspect of video games that I find very interesting is that video games are always systems. They're systems, and these are good games, so they are not buggy and they do not break down, and they require the kind of thinking that we do not always, especially in the humanities, are taught to use. So looking the games, and whatever you do doesn't matter if it's an adventure game or a first-person shooter or a kind of a strategy game. They require the kind of thinking where you have to think ahead, where you have to collate and juggle and combine and think about a whole number of factors and variables. And this is very useful potentially, because this is exactly what our world is. Our world is a system. The problem is, of course, it's an insane, complicated system with a level of complexity that even the best of games can hope or cannot hope to achieve. But if we're going to learn to look at things and not look at the world, only in black and white terms, definitely games are a very good place to start. Not about the content of games as opposed to the content of the world, but basically the mental cognitive strategies that we, I think, should use. So these are just 3 examples. And a good example, and this is my favorite one, so I can never really pass using that in any kind of presentation, is in that book, Everything Bad is Good for You, which is, right off the bat is a great title. Stephen Johnson, an interesting cultural historian, cultural critic, has this thought experiment about games. Thought experiment in which he imagines a world in which games, not books, were the first cultural form. And he goes on, and of course it's a thought experiment, he's not really suggesting this. And he goes on, in case, I'll just read it very quickly, in case you can see that. Reading books, this is the beginning of a thought experiment, reading books chronically understimulates the senses. Unlike the long-standing tradition of game playing, which engages the child in a vivid three-dimensional world filled with moving images and musical soundscapes, navigated and controlled with complex muscular movements, books are simply a barren stream of words on the page. Only a small portion of the brain devoted to processing written language is activated during reading, while games engage the full range of the sensory and motor cortices. Books are also tragically isolating. While games have for many years engaged the young in complex social relationships with their peers, building and exploring worlds together, books force the child to sequester him or herself in a quiet space shut off from interaction with other children. These new libraries, like our libraries, that have arisen in recent years to facilitate reading activities are a frightening sight. Dozens of young children, normally so vivacious and socially interactive, sitting alone in cubicles, reading silently, oblivious to their peers. Many children enjoy reading books, of course, and no doubt some of the flights of fancy conveyed by reading have their escapist merits. But for a sizable percentage of the population, books are downright discriminatory. The reading craze of recent years cruelly taunts the 10 million Americans who suffer from dyslexia, a condition that didn't even exist as a condition until printed text came along to stigmatize sufferers. But perhaps the most dangerous property of these books is the fact that they follow a fixed, linear path. You can't control their narratives in any fashion. You simply sit back and have the story dictated to you. For those of us raised on interactive narratives, this property may seem astonishing. Why would anyone want to embark on an adventure utterly choreographed by another person, right? But today's generation embarks on such adventures millions of times a day. This risks instilling a general passivity in our children, making them feel as though they are powerless to change their circumstances. Reading is not an active participatory process. It's a submissive one. The book readers of the young generation are learning to follow the plot instead of learning to lead. Which, of course, it's a thought experiment, and this doesn't mean that Johnson disrespects or does not value books. He does. He writes books himself. But it's a thought experiment, and you could use a different form of thought experiment equally for science fiction comics. It shows us that some of the things that people have been saying about video games, not even the content of particular video games, but basically the form of video games is very relative and very sort of entrenched in a certain position that is historically understandable and probably justified, but it's no longer defensible, especially if you sort of, for the purposes of the experiment, sort of overstate the case. Now, so that brings me to the last section. Why should we study these things? And again, the answer, if you ask why, there are 10,000 answers, so these are going to be necessarily selected. But the first of the reasons is that these three forms, science fiction, comics, video games, are probably much better than, again, well, I have to fall back on traditional books, right? But they exemplify what we call the flows, the contemporary flows of culture much better than the traditional so-called high culture. So if you talk about the whole range of cultural phenomena, especially where culture intersects with both social concerns and economies, if you talk about, for instance, the whole phenomenon, the explosion of various adaptations and remediations, if you think about the rise of transmedia stories, and I'll give you an example in a sec, or the complete transformation of audiences from the passive consumers into active participants, right? If you think about the rise of so-called paratext, what Gerard Genet called paratext, there are all kinds of texts that accompany the main narrative, and the globality of culture over the last 20, 30 years. These three discourses, science fiction, comics, video games, are best examples. And so for instance, and this is just one example of the top, which actually involves all three, because it's a science fiction story, which also involves comics and video games. So The Matrix, which I assume people at least know about, if you don't know. One of the big accusations that came up, especially after the first movie and after the second and the third. The first movie was received very positively, both critically and commercially. But after the second and the third, somehow at that point, the Wachowski brothers, not the Wachowski sisters, it was like, they screwed up, excuse my French, and somehow they clearly, for many people, stopped knowing how to make movies. Of course, this was not the case. All the holes and all the questions that the second and third Matrix movie leaves are answered, but they are answered in comic books, in video games, and a series of animated shorts that are collected as animatrix. Because from the very, very beginning, The Matrix was conceived of as a transmedia story, in not a system of adaptations, but a transmedia story in which you need to become acquainted with all chains, all nodes, in order to get the whole story, in order to understand it. Which, of course, was a big demand, because even people who go and see big science fiction blockbusters in movie theaters do not necessarily have to read comics or play video games. But if you wanted to get the story, you had to. And The Matrix still remains probably the best example of that. But this is a completely different strategy of telling stories, but also puts completely different demands on the audiences and makes the audiences much more active in their construction of meaning. So those are the flows of culture, the first reason. The second one is, of course, yes, like the kind of things that we were taught in school about, so books, maybe occasionally movies, all these three forms can be insanely complex. They have what I call textual complexity, right? And of course, textual complexity, has been very important for us. And this is again one of my favorite quotes from James Elkins, an art historian from the Chicago School. When he, a brilliant, very open-minded person for an art historian, who are really a lot of times a very conservative crowd, when he says that the majority of the essays in the humanities, and that really concerns not just the essays in the humanities, but what we, as especially educated audiences like, have as a primary methodological orientation and interest in complexity and ambiguity. And he says the plurality of texts describe cultural locations, practices, identities, and objects as, and I love this list, hybrid, mixed, impure, marginal, dislocated, disoriented, Creole, pidgin, transcultural, liminal, meta, para, or otherwise complex and ambiguous. And of course, within this tradition, the pleasure of a text and the value of a text in any medium or in any form is measured basically by how much of that hybrid, mixed, impure, marginal, and so on, complexity texts possess, right? And because of that, that especially historically, the simpler texts were precisely rejected because somehow they lacked this hook, or they lacked this depth into which you could sink your hooks, critical hooks, or kind of the audience hooks. And of course, if you really want that, I'm not even necessarily sure this complexity is a necessary requirement for something to be culturally valuable. But even if you go along these critical positions, of course, all three can give you all of this in abundance. If you're a linguist, for instance, it's impossible not to read Embassy Town by China Mieville, British science fiction writer, which is not actually diluted linguistics. This is pretty heavy linguistics. And if you play the video game named The Witness by Jonathan Blow, which has been, for good reasons, called or reviewed as the game equivalent of a Thomas Pynchon novel. And Blow, in fact, said he wanted to be a Thomas Pynchon of video games. These are not the kind of things that you would just kind of sit down to and just browse through, kind of fly through. So there is a lot of that complexity. These are just kind of the two randomly selected examples. There is, of course, all these three forms, as I said, they possess critical potential. Critical potential, in a sense, not critical, you can do textual criticism, but critical potential that they can critically approach the world. I think we do need all our cultural forms, our artistic forms, to engage with the world with those kind of numerous problems that we have had on all possible levels. And I think we've had enough of art for art's sake, although there are pleasures in that too. So for instance, if you look at science fiction is a perfect example, novels like The Water Knight, which is about the water situation in the southwest of the United States, which is nothing short of dramatic, but somehow we don't even think about it too much. If you think about Sleep Dealer, which is a Mexican science fiction film that deals with a question of technology and trans-border migration, both legal and illegal, and the exploitation of workers in in developing countries by transnational corporations. This is precisely movies that are very critical about these phenomena. If you think about comics, there are very few other cultural forms that have engaged the aftermath of Katrina, of course, a major disaster, in such a beautiful way as a comic book by Josh Neufeld, A.D. New Orleans, after the deluge, of course referring to the biblical deluge. Or with games, games like Papers, Please, where, which is not, as you can see on the right, graphically very sophisticated, but that puts you in a very difficult morally and psychological position of a border guard in this fictional country of Artochka, where you have to decide who you let in and who you do not let into the country. And there is a system that I don't have time to go into, but it really, if you play this game long enough, you realize that even the most oppressive systems, as presumably the system of Artochka, are in fact created not by sort of demonized dictators, but people like you and me, and making, very simple decisions, most of the time, not political decisions, but you just want to be able to pay your bills and feed your family, which is exactly what you need to do. But you make all these life and death decisions about people who you let or do not let into the country. And again, I'll be happy to talk about it if you have questions about it. So it's again very, very political and very consequential in terms of this connectivity to the real world game. And then, of course, you have, for all three forms, all kinds of static cultural, political modalities, that are specific to each of them. And as examples, for instance, if you think about text that some people call games, but they are not really games, because they do not have goals, they do not have win conditions, they do not have any challenges thrown at you. As D. Arrester, an example of a form that has been called the first-person walker, because you essentially just walk in, as you can see, hopefully, in these beautifully crafted worlds. And there are stories, many of them, to discover, and there are beautiful sights to look at, but there's nothing else to do. I mean, the closest you could imagine if you were able to go into and walk around the worlds of some of your favorite paintings. So a cultural form, a cultural engagement which has very little precedence, that is very interesting, still relatively new and developing. Or if you think about comics, which we usually think about as those simple issues, thicker or thinner, that can be much more complicated. Building stories by Chris Work, who has always been a fascinating graphic novelist, which is the whole box of different, pieces, I guess. Some of them are like books or booklets or issues, but some of them are posters that we pulled out that really challenge how you even read a comic, because in many of them, as you can see, you do not really have a familiar structure of panels where you go from left to right and top to bottom. But again, makes us wonder, okay, so how do we read, like literally sometimes even in terms of direction, and how do you put together meaning that is not clearly hierarchical, that you can decide in which order you read those elements. There are altogether, I think, 16 pieces within that box titled Building Stories. Or if you think about things like World of Warcraft, which, you think, dwarves and giants and fantasy, and not even the kind of fantasy like, Game of Thrones, I mean, there is a very compelling argument that World of Warcraft is the most late capitalist game ever made, and despite the veneer of being medieval and feudal, in fact, it encourages you to pursue all kinds of behaviors that are, or customs or practices that are essential to being presumably successful in the neoliberal capitalist economy. And sort of unwittingly teaching millions and millions of young players, how to be a good cog in the machine. I'm being sort of critical here, of course. And really, since I've been I'll be really talking about these three forms, but as I mentioned earlier, I mean, I could be talking about other areas of so-called, or the thing previously called, known as popular culture. So you could, for instance, look, and you may not like Beyonce, I do not like Beyonce myself, but probably a video that was a big discussion earlier this year, Formation, that was debuted just before the Super Bowl. Is probably one of the most interesting, one of the most complex engagements of blackness in the United States and all the political and economic problems that are connected with that. And doesn't give very easy answers or responses. Or you could look at some of the television series, and especially after the recent elections, House of Cards is just peanuts. If you thought this was about American politics, it's not. I think Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead gives you a much better set of metaphors, to think about post-Trump America. And of course, again, many of these, especially cable television, so HBO or Showtime, TV shows, really very successfully rival the form of a novel as a kind of long-form storytelling form. And without comparing, it's really hard to compare. So that kind of arguments that I have made about those three forms, science fiction, comics, and video games, could be made about other parts, other media, other cultural forms, and what is previously known or was known as popular culture. Or finally, if you look at digital graphics, which again, this is visuality coming in, we don't actually even have good methods yet to think about what is really going on in imagery like that, which is very apropos. It's a reworking, this kind of moving GIF of a digital art. What is very interesting, the animation that was made by George Red Hawk. It's not a pseudonym, it's actually a Native American artist who cannot see, who is blind. So this, what you see was really created by a blind person. But even if you look at it from a purely formal point of view, we don't quite have the tools to talk about these such visual texts. I mean, what do you concentrate on first? I mean, what do you make of the moving parts? Where do you start looking and talking about this picture? But of course, it is a subjective judgment. It is very beautiful. It is, there are things happening, but we have yet to learn how to talk about the thing previously known as popular culture. Thank you.
Paweł, thank you for this intellectually stimulating talk, and the floor is open to questions.
One at a time, of course. Yeah.
That was really interesting. Thanks, Paweł. Thinking about the justifications we offer often to our disciplines for the relevance of science fiction writing for comic books, and games. In my own institution, thinking about the kind of disciplinarity, disciplinary elements, and the institutional base of disciplines. In my own institution, we're having a discussion that I think we couldn't have anticipated 3 or 4 years ago, which is, I'm in English studies, so we're still having a conversation about how we talk about things like games, and we started to do that, but I know that some of my colleagues aren't very comfortable with that conversation, but we're still having it. But another conversation came from elsewhere, which is from university managers, and it was in relation to how the relevance of something like literary studies, English literary studies, might be understood. We were encouraged very strongly to start to think about how we incorporate, for example, games studies, video game criticism into our modules in order to give our subject greater relevance. So even if internally that conversation was still going on about how aesthetic value might be compromised or corrupted by the presence of something like video game studies within English, there was another kind of response coming to us, which is about the need to maintain the relevance of our discipline based upon what the university calls called market research, what students want to see in English. So the transformation, the perception of what the discipline might be, changed for us at that point, I think, and all of a sudden we saw that we were under threat because we weren't doing these other kinds of things in English studies. So do you see what I mean? That there's no longer a sense of there being an emergent area, subfield within English studies, but something else which suggests that it supplies something like a dominance outside of the discipline that's coming to affect us within it.
Sure, I mean that's a very good point. This is just kind of a neoliberal logic that comes in, and I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I mean, one part of the answer would be that while of course things like English or Anglophone literature has long been defended on the grounds of being sort of humanistic and sort of a kind of that's why we need to train students in these things, because this is part of the development of an adult free thinking citizen, blah blah blah. But of course, I don't think it was any less political in the past. Of course, teaching literature was, of course, how you construct your syllabus and your canon was as political as nowadays, as you said, sort of pushing video games because they are sexy and they attract students, right? While they may be, for some people, aesthetically suspect. So I'm not sure I have a good answer. I mean, probably I would be university president or a dean at least. But you're definitely right when you talk about the administrators love at least some of that stuff, because that's a good way to attract the students. When we started this video game research center, which is a research center at my university, and we really wanted to do research and some events, but we didn't really want to go into sort of teaching immediately, because constructing a program is a nightmare. Like within 5 months, we had university admins coming to us, would you think about opening a BA track? Which of course we didn't, because that's a lot of work, and we just needed to apply for grants and play games for research. Well, other things too. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are kind of political tensions around that on the one hand may seem to privilege certain forms like these newer forms. On the other hand, I would probably say that in some cases this is also a very cynical way, or very cynical strategy that administrators, especially in the United States, this is something that I know fairly well, try to use to split people that they perceive as humanities, that think to sort of more useful people teaching and applying this newer stuff into more traditional academics, who are often perceived as kind of, it's not irrelevant and sort of partly uses kind of as an intellectual luxury, so people who teach literature. And I don't think, and we are really right in the middle of this sort of corporatization of universities. I mean, all over Europe and essentially everywhere in the world. So I'm not sure I have, but that's a very good point. Yeah.
Yes, kind of a two-part question. Like, seeing as you use examples in your pictures of mostly how people would call like art, games or whatever, but you also gave examples of walking simulators and Spec Ops The Line. I wanted to ask what your opinion is of the kind of fabricated ludology, narratology debate regarding video games, and kind of in that line, do you think, considering most of the games you showed were indie, that big budget games can really be as good or as critically engaging as The Witness and so on?
And the first part was, once again, sorry.
The first part was what your opinion is on the, Ludo narrative.
Okay, yeah, okay, sorry, yeah, great. Well, I think that discussion was really largely fabricated when it sort of raged on in the early 21st century, and I think it's completely gone. And again, it was more political. Essentially, the ludology as a way of approaching games was, it's not a coincidence, most people subscribing to this position were people coming out of sort of computer science or programming departments, whereas the so-called narratologists were people from film studies, occasionally from literature, who kind of found games interesting. So again, it was really about the shape of the field and the justification of where we apply for grants, the science foundations or rather to the kind of humanities programs. And I don't think it's, saying either or. Games, yes, they are playful constructs, and they are at the same time texts, like novels or television shows. But the second part of the question, a number of titles with games that I showed were kind of independent games, but definitely there is potential for big, as I call AAA games. In fact, the game that I showed early on, Spec Ops The Line, which is a major game, is really Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now in the game form. And although at first it seems to be just like another shooter in the Middle East, it's basically about a marine troop of Marines or special op forces that have to go into Dubai to retrieve the commander who refuses to come back. And of course, we see where this story is going. And the game itself is absolute genius. If you think Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now are genius text. So that's a major text. There are other games like the Mass Effect trilogy, which, in a lot of ways, in narrative terms, psychological terms of what it does to the players is really significant. So there's definitely potential in major blockbuster games too, although in those games the pulls and pushes of the commercial circumstances are stronger than compared to when you talk about the so-called independent games, which, while operating in smaller budgets, have more, relatively speaking, more creative freedom. But I would never think in terms of, so again, black and white, but big games are always crap, and independent games are always artistically achieved.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry we don't have any more time. There's another session following up. So thank you, Paweł, once again.